Harrison, previously co-founded a company called Paddle, as Stephen said, and now working on a new venture at GoodFit. Maybe just for a second of background, so started Paddle 10 years ago. It's now kind of hundreds of staff, recently named a unicorn with our last fundraise, which was very cool. So now going back to a team of 8 or so folks has been quite the change, but very good fun. Been working with Notion since 2017, when they led the Paddle kind of Series B fundraise, and now working with Notion as an expert, mainly talking about go-to-market, but sometimes the founder experience and things too. Super excited today to be talking about mapping the market. I think every single one of us has at some point talked about our addressable market, right? Whether that's in go-to-market planning, evaluating maybe new business opportunities, or even just convincing investors we're operating in a space that's worth investing in. But despite that, I always feel that it's something that people really struggle with and panic about that slide and maybe the board deck, and they struggle to get confidence in. And I think that's even true of the investors. I've chatted to a bunch of investors recently who also are trying to evaluate the size of opportunity in some of the investments they're making, and this is something they also struggle with. So looking forward to chatting about it today. In terms of what to expect, we'll start with some definitions. We'll then talk about why we map the market. What is it we're actually trying to achieve? We'll then talk about common pitfalls. What goes wrong when we try to do this in the first place, with some case studies. We'll then give you some tips as to how you can go away and more effectively map your market than perhaps what exists today and is status quo. And then what that improved market mapping unlocks for your business. Is this worth it? What do we achieve with a slightly more granular understanding of the market that we're selling into? And then last but not least, I'd love to share how you can avoid many of the mistakes that I've made in relation to this topic over the past 10 years. It was just yesterday evening that Stephen and I were sharing some more stories on all the things that had gone wrong there, given we hadn't heeded the advice, which I'm now very glad to share with some of you guys. Interrupt me with questions. I'm sure Claire and Stephen will keep a hawk eye on the chat if people throw some stuff in there. I'll try to pause as well throughout and ask you guys if there's anything that's confusing or you'd like me to cover in any more detail. Make sense for folks? Everyone good with that? Yeah, some nodding faces. Cool. So what do we mean by mapping the market? So lots of people talk about mapping their market in some very different ways, right? And it's important to ensure we're on the same page. I think when we started Paddle back in 2012, folks only really talked about the concept of your total addressable market, your TAM. And I expect this is something pretty much everyone listening in today has heard of. But in more recent times, I'm starting to hear more and more about the concepts of TAM, SAM, SOM. Some of you might have seen some articles on that in the past. And when you're hearing that, this is what people are talking about. So the biggest circle is your total addressable market. This is the total market demand for your product, often the size of an industry or a sector in its own right in a lot of instances. Within that, you have your service addressable market. This is the segment of the TAM that the company actually has a fit for today, who can literally use your product, who you proactively selling to and who you can service. And then within the SAM, you have the SOM. So this is the service obtainable market. This is the proportion of the SAM that a company can realistically achieve, or who you're prioritizing given a limitation of resources or presence of competition or your own headquarters. There's lots of different variables which might impact that. And you can see why folks have started to think in this way. It's pretty sensible. TAM is a measure of the size of the market you operate within. Often, as I said, it's like the size of the industry or the sector. SAM is who within that market you have a product for today. And then the SOM is who within the SAM you want to target first based on current understanding. It's pretty sensible. There's lots of acronyms that get thrown around the office, which is quite fun. But it has some flaws, I think. And we're going to come back to those throughout and give you some advice as to how to navigate the differences between these kind of circles on a slide. All with me so far? Yeah. So my advice would be to spend your time looking at your service addressable market, right? I tried to keep things as simple as possible and zero in on one of them. And this is really the size of the market that we can service today. And this is where, you should spend most of your time. But why? I mean, if you're working in a massive industry or a TAM, but none of them can actually use your products, like it doesn't really matter. And now, whilst it's important to share a TAM with the investment community, which I think is what Stephen was alluding to just a minute ago, if we don't actually have a product for these folks right now, or we don't intend to target them for the foreseeable future, it means that our understanding of them can be limited, right? Folks often think of a lot of things, but certainly market mapping as finite. Have we done it or have we not? But actually it's a spectrum, and you can get an understanding of your market and those within it to different levels of detail, different levels of confidence, through different data sources, and even different levels of investment, depending on where you're looking and how deep you want to go. And I think an understanding of the TAM, like this kind of very large market and industry you're working, is important, but a high level understanding is normally appropriate for folks, in my opinion, compared to your service addressable market. So to give you an example, Paddle operates in the $200 billion SaaS industry. This is our TAM. You could argue it's a software industry, which is just slightly larger, right? That's our total addressable market. That's awesome, but it's not super useful beyond expressing we're just working in a really large and fast growing sector at that level of detail. But that's basically what I use it for when chatting to investors. What I care a lot more about as an operator is the SaaS companies with a self-serve checkout who are between $1 to $75 million in revenues, because these are the people that I have a product for today, I'm proactively targeting and want to go and sell to. So my level of understanding for that group of people, I want to be much, much more granular. And this is kind of the difference between the two. It is critical we prioritize which companies we go after within that SAM, although I'm not convinced that thinking about it in terms of the service obtainable market or SOM is the best way to do that. And I'm going to give you some alternatives for you to consider there later, and you can determine what's best for you and your business. I guess the TLDR is just be careful where you focus and don't get distracted by lots of these acronyms around. I would suggest that you focus on your service addressable market, those who can use your product today, because it's those people we really want a deep understanding of, given we're going to go out and market to them and sell to them. And a lot of the reason we focus on them is driven by what we're actually trying to achieve from market mapping in the first place. So what are those things? So first and foremost, we map the market to understand the size of the business opportunity you and your business have ahead of you, right? How much like revenue potential is there in the service addressable market that you operate in today, right? I'd suggest you look at the total size of that market and apply some basic funnel performance to it and see where you end up in terms of revenue at the end of that process. There's going to be some assumptions in there, but it's a good back and napkin exercise to do. And is that revenue going to be high enough to sustain the company over the next X years or get you through to your next fundraising? And it gives you forward visibility into whether you're operating within a market that's going to allow you to achieve whatever you believe you need to achieve in order to hit that next milestone for your business. I often work with like early stage companies on some of this stuff who've built like a really great product for a really narrow audience. And all the time I see them freak out that there are like only 2,000 companies globally that meet this really narrow criteria of companies they're trying to sell to. When in reality, they have like 3 customers today and like 20 months of runway, and they think they need to get to like 15 or 30 to go out and raise the next round. And I'm like, guys, if that's the case, it's fine that you've got 2,000 customers that you're selling to globally. Go out and win, 30 of them and go and raise your next round, and take comfort in the knowledge that at some point you're going to exhaust that market, right? And express that the intention to broaden it to your existing and future investors and give them real clarity on who you're targeting today, why you're targeting them, and how that's going to evolve in the future, right? It doesn't need to be the biggest number in the world right away. It's just incredibly important that you have visibility into the size of the opportunity, both in terms of revenue and number of companies, so that you know how that needs to evolve in the future. And people are going to be very comfortable expressing your intention to grow your serviceable addressable market, provided you've proven that you can win within an adjacent market already. The second reason that you map your market is to understand the number of the companies that are out there that we can sell to. So there's some crossover with number one. You want to look at the number of companies as well as the revenue potential. And that's because the number of companies that are out there really influences our go-to-market approach. We ran a webinar just a couple of months ago on how, which basically gave you a framework to determine whether a product-led kind of go-to-market motion or a sales-led go-to-market motion could be right for you to help people navigate that decision in the early stages. And one of the key inputs to that decision or that discussion was how many companies that are out there we can actually sell to in our service addressable market. If there are only like 500 companies out there, it will inform how we choose to approach or attract them, potentially even how we like price our product. Like if there are 500 of them, we might determine that the best ROI or the most cost-effective or efficient way for us to go to market is sales-led, one-to-one going after those 500 companies. If there are like tens of thousands of them out there who understand our value proposition and are actively seeking a solution for it, perhaps product-led makes more sense for us, right? This is how the number of companies can influence your kind of go-to-market approach. On the pricing side, in a hypothetical world, if I'm selling like a contract management tool to big banks and there's only 500 of them, if I'm currently charging those folks like 10,000 bucks each for my product, it's probably not big enough to be an investable business. So I either need to work out how I can deliver more value to that addressable market so I can charge them more, or quite quickly start to think about how I'm going to strategically expand my serviceable addressable market. With me so far? Yeah. And the third reason we want to map the market is to effectively prioritize who is most likely to buy. Right, this is something we'll discuss later a little bit. And again, I think we ran the webinar on prioritization just a month or two ago. But in short, if there are 10,000 customers or companies in your serviceable addressable market, but you only have visibility into say like 3,000 of them, even if you're prioritizing those 3,000 really, really effectively, the chances are there are companies within the 7,000 that you don't have visibility into, which actually have a higher propensity to buy than the 3,000 you have visibility into today. This is why it's really important to map that full market of companies that you can service. I was actually chatting to Rob. Yep.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Can I ask a quick question? In your experience, what's the best way to understand that there is that 10,000 in the first place? I mean, if you've only got that 3,000 on your CRM, for example, what's your experience of how do you go and find, oh, actually there is 10 and we only know 3?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're basically looking at what's called coverage there. And the way that I would do it is you look at, if you constantly are finding companies that you haven't found, you've obviously got a coverage issue, right? So we're going to talk about the different ways in which you can actually try and map your market very shortly. And if you map your market through one of those means, and then you cross-reference that with, say, all of the customers that you've won today, and you're not seeing good crossover of those companies, it looks like you've probably got a coverage issue. You need to determine which of them that you haven't identified, why aren't they in the places that I'm currently looking, and try to evolve how you're actually mapping the market to cater for the people that you aren't currently finding today. It's basically like a coverage analysis exercise. It's that you want to try and pull a list of companies, you want to map your market through some methods that I'm going to talk about later, and then cross-reference that with customers that you've won or people that you know to definitely be in your market to make sure you've got a good coverage of those from whatever sources you're using to map the market to determine whether you're doing it right. The thing that I'd set your expectation on is that you're never going to get to 100%. Like there are always going to be companies out there that you haven't found, but that shouldn't influence how we're actually using the data. Like there's always going to be a degree of error or a margin of error, but we want to get as close to this as we possibly can. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's right. So on the effective prioritization piece, maybe just to conclude, and thanks for the question, that's awesome. I was chatting with Ryan, the CMO at a company called Mutiny, just last week, like a big MarTech product that I'd recommend. And they built out this incredibly comprehensive like scoring mechanism, right? Which looks at a lot of different signals to determine who's the very best fit for Mutiny so they can prioritize their ad spend or their sales team's efforts to go and win the companies that are most likely to buy. But Ryan's concern was, he was like, right now I'm just randomly pulling lists of accounts from places and to score them and then work out who we're going to go after. But he was like, because I'm not scoring the entire market, I'm sure there's just opportunities that I'm missing out on here. This is why you want to map your market before you get into that prioritization phase, which is exactly the point that I'm making under number 3. And then last but not least, the fourth reason we kind of want to map the market is to align our teams around a common set of accounts and contacts that we can go and target. So we want to map the market of accounts that we can sell to. We want to ensure there are enough of them to actually meet our growth ambitions. We then want to prioritize those that are most likely to buy. And then we want to align our go-to-market teams around those accounts and contacts which are most likely to buy. So some of you may be going into FY23 planning right now, which I'm sure it's very intense for all of you, and thinking about things like account distribution. If sales and marketing are clear on who we're targeting, and we can point them at the same set of accounts and contacts, this alignment is where you'll see the greatest results, right? So at Paddle, when I was running sales there back in the day, we had BDRs running email, a set of accounts and contacts we'd predetermined. We'd mapped the market, we'd scored them, and we sent them after those that we felt most likely to buy. But those same contacts we followed around on paid social with the same messaging using things like LinkedIn audiences. And this is true alignment, right? You've got two teams going after the same set of accounts and even people within them. And if you can even align the message they're sending, things get really powerful. But what we saw was the accounts and contacts which engage with the marketing touch point were twice as likely to reply to a sales rep's email as those that didn't, right? It shows you this real power of alignment and some of the tools that you can achieve, and really dispels the quite old school thinking around, marketing are going after X group, sales are going after Y group. the thing that you could bear in mind there is that typically marketing can concurrently target a slightly broader set of companies than sales can, but you should do your best to at least align sales and marketing around a common set of accounts in most instances. Making sense as to why we want to map the market and some of the things it allows us to do before I move on to talk about some of the challenges that people have and pitfalls and how we can actually go about doing this more effectively. Any other questions for now? Good. Yeah, sweet. Just throw them in the chat if you got any. So I wanted to call out at this point, one of the most common issues folks face when mapping the market, like it's probably the most common issue. And this issue is normally driven from founders. If there are any C-level execs on the line, they might have heard this one, and maybe we've caused this issue ourselves. But often I think there's a misunderstanding between what founders think investors want and what they actually want or are looking for, right? I think folks often feel they need to put the biggest dollar figure in front of investors with regards to their addressable market for them to consider investing in their company, which I'm not sure is strictly true, or at least it's not that simple. Right? The investor needs to believe in your business and believe that it's capable of growing into a very large business for them to get a return on their money. But as I said right at the start, I think a reasonable level of TAM understanding would deliver this. And again, Stephen alluded to this right at the start. You do need that, don't get me wrong. But in my experience, what really gets the investors excited is an incredibly deep understanding of the profile and the number of companies you plan to sell to between now and your next fundraise or now and your next milestone. Right. So, for example, and this is a hypothetical with some elements of truth, like all the best stories, Paddle sells revenue infrastructure to software companies, right, like payments and so on and so forth. And one of Paddle's strongest value propositions is helping software companies sell internationally. So when I think about this in terms of what I might want to demonstrate to an investor when having discussions around my market, I might want to say, look, we work within the huge total addressable market that is software worth hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. But there are 20,000 software companies globally with a self-serve checkout over 20K MRR. This is those that I deem serviceable for Paddle, and I'll go into more detail on that later. And within that 20,000, there are 4,000 that I believe have the highest likelihood to buy right now. And that's because Paddle's value proposition is around helping people sell internationally. And those 4,000 companies have, say, non-homogeneous web traffic above like 30% whilst operating in a single language and a single currency. If you can articulate that there are 4,000 of those people and then list each and every single one of them and all of the personas that exist within those companies and where they're based, and then you can articulate to the investor the team you plan to build with their investment to go and capture those folks, this gets them really, really excited because it's such a granular level understanding of who it is you're targeting, why you're going to win them, and how you're going to go about winning them. You've already found them. You already know what their pains are. You just need the resources to go and effectively sell to them. But you can also play this forward, right? It doesn't just have to be on the now. So you could say, better yet, look, I've got these 4,000 folks that are my focus initially. I think in selling to them, I'm going to be able to get us to revenue Y or reach point Z in our fundraising life cycle. But following this, there's a further 8,000 folks with a slightly different profile that I want to target next. Maybe in Paddle's instance, they're doing self-serve checkouts and invoicing. And you could say, look, these customers have pains X, Y, and Z. I'm going to be ready to serve them in quarter A. My product development's at point B, going to be ready in 3 months. So here's my phased go-to-market approach to start expanding those that we're really zeroing in on, and we're going to go and sell to, and that's going to get us to revenue point, whatever, A, B, or C. Again, what really excites people is not only the size of the TAM that you're operating within, but it's the clarity of and granular understanding of the customers you're trying to sell to, and also the clarity of execution, which really gets the investors going. It's that deep understanding of the customers you'll target today, how you're going to win them, why you're going to win them, and even your plans as to how that's going to evolve, which really excites the investors, not just necessarily the biggest numbers on the screen. Make sense? Cool. So let's talk about some case studies, right? So when people actually try and map the market, why do they struggle, or how could we do this more effectively? So as a disclaimer, I understand this problem super well from the Paddle perspective. Yotpo is another company that I pulled at random. I've chatted to them in the last couple of weeks, but I have no affiliation with them at all. But I grabbed them just to demonstrate the challenges that you guys might be facing, and certainly they face when trying to map the market. So maybe just for some context first. So Paddle is a payments infrastructure company for software. Said it so many times it didn't almost roll off the tongue. And Yotpo is an all-in-one marketing platform for e-com. So the TAM for Paddle is in theory the whole of the software market, right? But the SAM is any software company globally with over 20K MRR and a self-serve checkout. And that's because These companies need to be doing over 20k MRR for it to be sustainable for Paddle to sell to them and support them. And they need a self-serve checkout because Paddle's core product is this checkout, and there's lots of adjacent things that come around that. If the customer's only invoicing, they can't actually sell to them, at least right now. You can see how that's a refined layer going from TAM down to SAM. For Yotpo, they can in theory sell into the whole e-commerce market, right? And their SAM's actually relatively broad. They think that they can sell really effectively into anyone with over 3 employees in e-commerce. So these are the 2 companies that we're going to talk about as we start to think about some of the challenges that people face when trying to map the market that some of you may have experienced. So what challenges do they have? The challenges really revolve around like false positives. So folks that you think should be included in your serviceable addressable market, but don't actually meet your kind of basic criteria, or false negatives, right? There are folks out there that look like they should be included, but you never find them, but on a closer inspection should definitely be included in your market mapping. We often call this qualifying someone in or out of your market mapping. So you qualify them in if the criteria that needs to be true for them to be in your serviceable addressable market is true, include them, qualify them in. If they don't meet that criteria, we qualify them out. So you might hear that concept as we work through this today. So thinking about the Paddle example, one of the most common pitfalls that I see, what Paddle did fall into and have since solved, but others do too, is a reliance on like basic industry filters in order to map their market, right? So if I'm Paddle and I want to map the market of software companies that are out there, when I try and pull the companies listed as software on LinkedIn, many of them are indeed software companies, which is great, but only a percentage of them have an online checkout, right? Which means that they aren't serviceable to Paddle today, and they're false positives. There's also a statistically significant portion of them that don't label themselves on LinkedIn as software companies at all, right? So in theory, I could really easily miss them during my market mapping. So you can see how the false positives and negatives come about as a result of using some of these blunt industry filters. I'm going to go a layer deeper on that in a second. On the Yotpo side, when I speak to a lot of companies in e-commerce, in order to avoid their reliance on industry filters, they use things like technographics to map their market. This is super common in e-commerce. So they say, I want to find e-commerce companies. Shopify have got a huge market share in e-commerce. Why don't I just pull any company using Shopify to map my market? It seems sensible, but sadly that doesn't work either. Right, you see a ton of false positives again, a bunch of folks using Shopify to like sell the odd t-shirt, but they aren't actually an e-commerce business, or a ton of false negatives. There's obviously a bunch of people out there using different tooling or homegrown solutions that will be completely missed from the mapping in the first place. To go one layer deeper, on the LinkedIn challenge, if I'm Paddle looking for software companies and I look for people under software development, I find Campaign Monitor, awesome, this works, easy to find, everything's great. Maybe then I look at NAN, and these guys are listed as IT services and consulting, which isn't ideal because for me, this is a software company with a self-serve checkout that I want to include in my market mapping. But if I include all of IT services and consulting in my market mapping, I'm going to get a ton of false positives, right? There may be some software companies in that group with checkouts under that label, but there's going to be a hell of a lot that I'm going to need to disqualify, which is where the problems start to arise. Worse yet, Hootsuite have listed themselves under like advertising services. But for me, this is someone I want to include in my market mapping, right? This is a SaaS product for social media management. I want to be able to go and sell to them. And I absolutely can't include everyone in advertising services in my market mapping because there's just going to be tons of people in there that are nothing to do with who I want to sell to. This is quite common on LinkedIn, where a company will actually list themselves in the industry they themselves are targeting, as opposed to the industry themselves they work within. You can see how this quite quickly becomes a problem if you're relying on industry filters in something like LinkedIn or ZoomInfo or whatever it may be. On the technographic side, one of the cheaper technographic providers out there you might have seen is a company called BuiltWith. So I jumped on there over the weekend to just grab a list of folks using Shopify to see what I could find ahead of the webinar today. So the very top domain that I saw was the Seahawks. And I don't know if we have any NFL fans in the room, but this is an NFL team's website, right? They sell like a single experience package over Shopify on their site, not their tickets, not a bunch of other stuff. It seems to be a very tiny, tiny portion of what it is that they do. And namely are focused on winning NFL games, to be honest with you. And this probably isn't someone that Yotpo want to sell to, right? This is a false positive. We probably don't want to include them in our market mapping at all. Yeah, it's the very top result that I saw when trying to pull a list. The second is show.com, which is Showtime's website. And again, this is a US company that produce like amazing TV shows, right? They have this tiny, tiny Shopify store, which sells like some TV shows and merchandise, like mugs. Again, this isn't really an e-commerce company that we probably want to include in our market mapping or we want the team to focus on. And again, we see another false positive. You can see our reliance on technographics and some of these industry filters causes people some problems. But this isn't just limited to software or e-commerce. Yotpo and Paddle were just the two examples that I wanted to demonstrate to you today. To give you another example, I work with a company called Oyster HR. They do like an employee of record solution, which basically helps people hire folks remotely. It's like deal.com or remote.com, globalization partners. There's a lot of them out there. So for someone like Oyster, their TAM is any company hiring, right? They help people hire. But their service addressable market is any company that's hiring remotely, because they help you place remote employees. But for years, they struggled to pull a list of companies with over one remote open role, right? Because they just can't get their hands on that data, right? No matter where they're trying to pull these lists of companies from, and they just can't get to that level of granularity they need to actually understand how many companies there are out there that they can service that are hiring for over one remote role. This is a really broad problem experienced by most people in most industries. Just going to pause before I talk about how we try and solve it. I don't think there's anything in the chat. Any questions? All following me? It's 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning. I'm lost. Let's talk about how we can solve it. So there are three common paths that people typically face. So one is they use humans. This is something I see really commonly used, but you'll really struggle to scale. But it's often the starting point for folks. I often see aggregators used. This is not as common, but can be a really great shortcut actually to finding a list of accounts that are really highly qualified, i.e. those we should qualify in and should certainly be included in our market mapping. And then the last is the use of custom models. So with enough labeled data, you can actually build out models which spit out a probability as to whether a company is qualified in for you or not, and that should be included in the data set. And then your market is all those that should be included that you've qualified in. And I'm going to go a layer deeper into each of them now. So on the human side, you can get humans to pull all of these companies under those different LinkedIn industries, say, and then manually research them and qualify in those that you like and qualify out those that you don't, and those that you qualify in is your market mapped effectively. This is really common. I see a lot of companies outsource this to efforts, given how time consuming it is. At one point at Paddle, I actually had 8 full-time, what I call lead development representatives who were just manually researching accounts for me at Paddle, doing exactly this. It was very expensive in central London. Before my now co-founder of GoodFit and his team worked to make that a little bit more programmatic. This is really common. But what's the challenge that you might face when trying to throw humans at this problem, which is a fair starting point? The issues you'll start to face are they're prone to error. Like, it can get lethargic going through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies every day. Like, it's a pretty thankless task. And actually, due to the human error that takes place, you can actually get to the point where models can perform better. But that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is that they just aren't quick enough, right? They aren't fast enough. It doesn't scale. So to use the Oyster example, there are thousands of companies out there, if not well over 100,000 companies at any one time, I think, that are hiring for over one remote employee, which is Oyster's serviceable addressable market. But humans actually can't find those people quick enough to feed the team at Oyster to have a relatively quick sales cycle. But worse yet, once they found an account that was within that serviceable addressable market and said that they have whatever 3 open remote roles, by next week, the number of open remote roles that company has probably changed, right? And they can't keep up with every single company in the world and that data point all the time. Because it's just physically not possible for them to just get through all of that stuff every single day and keep all of that data up to date. And that's a real problem for someone like Oyster, because whether they have an open remote role in the first place is really important to determine whether they're qualified in and someone they want to target the sales team or the marketing team to care about. But they also really prioritize companies differently based on the number of remote open roles that they have. The more, the better. So they want that data point as accurate as possible all the time. And it's just really impossible for humans to just keep up with that level of data and that breadth, considering how often it's changing. You just struggle to scale it, basically. After humans, we've got the aggregators. So sometimes you can work with aggregators to do a better job of refining your market down, right? So at Paddle, at one point, we only scraped companies from G2 and Capterra, and we started to use them as a reference for our market, and then through humans, the scraped aggregators, because we saw a higher qualification rate of self-serve kind of software companies there than from other sources. I think there are some better examples though, even within the Notion portfolio. So perhaps a better example is Easel. So this is a company in the Notion portfolio who offer like an all-in-one platform for managing experiences, think festivals and events. These guys scrape events under TripAdvisor and see a much higher qualification rate than if pulled from other sources. So it's a much better way for them to start to get to grips on the size of their market. I've seen companies that do like at-sea ordering using TripAdvisor to identify restaurants, or I think Muse in the Notion portfolio experimented with this too, and they scraped TripAdvisor for every single hotel there was out there. You can see how in scraping TripAdvisor for something like restaurants, you're going to see really high qualification rates and really reduce the number of false positives and false negatives that are out there, because if something's listed as a restaurant on TripAdvisor, it's probably a restaurant, right? So this is actually quite a good way to accurately map your market without the need necessarily for human intervention or a custom model. Maybe just scraping the aggregator does a good enough job for you. There is normally an industry-specific aggregator out there that you can use, but it will be different depending on the business that you're in. So one of the stranger examples that I saw was I chatted to a Notion company a long time ago now when I had slightly less grey hair that was called Kiss and Hub. And these folks work in agriculture, and they wanted to map the market of farmers in the UK because that's who they were selling to. And what we realized was that every single farmer in the UK needed a certain certification or qualification in order to farm here, right? And what we realized was that there was a database online of every single farmer that had this qualification, right? This was our aggregator of every farmer in the UK that Kiss and Hub could then go and sell to, right? You can think outside the box as to what this aggregator looks like for you and your business, albeit there are some that are quite commonly used. I've got some examples on the slide there. Last but not least, we've got custom models. So with enough labeled data, you can actually just build a probabilistic model which predicts whether a company is a good fit for you or not, someone you want to qualify in or not, to determine your market mapping. So to jump back to the Yotpo and Paddle examples, a good fit, given the demand for people to identify self-serve software companies or e-commerce, we've actually built models which predict whether companies fit within either of those two kind of criteria. I'm going to go into a level of detail on this in just a second, but the way it basically works is we take all of the text from a homepage, we run it through an ML model which spits out a probability as to whether it is a software company for Paddle or an e-commerce company for someone that might be interested in that. And we got those models performing to 90% accuracy because they've been trained on a really large data set. I'm going to talk about that in more detail in just a second. But you can basically build a model not only to predict whether something's e-com or not, but you can even build a model that's specific for your company. So I work with a company called Storyblock, raised lots of money, doing a great job. And I work with their partnerships team. So they partner with website development agencies because Storyblock is like a headless CMS. So those web dev agencies implement it for their clients. So the approach that they've taken was they started by scraping a company called Clutch.co, which I think is the biggest aggregator of agencies that are out there. But when the sales team started going after the agencies on Clutch, they were seeing a really high percentage of disqualification. This wasn't a very good way to have mapped their market and then start getting accounts and the names of their reps. So we got their reps to label who was good or a bad fit. And then we built a model for them, which actually predicted whether an agency was someone they wanted to sell to or not, with now like 75 to 80% accuracy. So we include anyone that the model says is a good fit, and 8 out of 10 times we're right. And this is also what I was talking about earlier in terms of there is going to be a degree of error in your market mapping that you're going to have to kind of get to grips with, but hopefully you can improve over time. The second example, like a company specific example, is Hokkaido, another Notion company who are kind of changing, I think, their ICP at the moment, but they're looking for companies in B2B industries with high value payments who would benefit from buy now, pay later, because they're like a buy now, pay later solution for B2B. You can see, like using LinkedIn or some of these other sources, it's very difficult to filter companies down based on those very specific criteria, right? Which is why they had to build a model. Models tend to work well in industries where there's like preconditions, like where you can only target a certain type of agency or a certain type of software company, where you'd normally need human intervention in order to determine whether they should be included or not. I think custom models, in a way, are the next evolution on the human research element that we talked about earlier. And in terms of how you implement them, I'm not the expert here, and I've worked with some good folks around me. But it's my understanding of what we're doing is called classification in the data world. So we're basically determining if something is a fit or not. And there's a fine line between classification or qualification, which is what we're talking about, and prioritization, which is something I'm going to talk about later. But if you and your business basically feel that reps can go on a website and identify who is a good fit versus a bad fit, a text-based ML model will probably work well for you. It seems to be for anyone that I'm chatting to about this. And the way you actually want to go about building one is you get a bunch of domains that you might pull from LinkedIn or one of the other sources we discussed. You need to label them as a good fit or a bad fit, a 0 or a 1, a true or a false. And you then need to collect text on each of the domains that you're trying to predict whether someone's a good fit for or not, and then run them through the machine learning model to spit out a probability. And then anyone over 50% probability is a true, and you'd include them in your data set, in your market mapping. You obviously need to train the ML model in the first instance with a bunch of labeled data that is accurately saying whether a company is true or false as to a good fit for you guys. There are some tools out there emerging to help with this. So the one I've been looking at recently is a tool called Monkey Learn. I think Clearbit actually use it. And all you need to do with Monkey Learn is literally just get a bigger list as you possibly can of companies that you've labeled as either a good fit or a bad fit for you, and it will actually build the model for you, which does this, and then you can upload domains to it, and it will spit out the probability as to whether they're a good fit or a bad fit for you, right? So it's definitely worth exploring. Just going to pause there for a second. There's a lot of information, and then I'm going to talk about what this basically unlocks you. If you do manage to get an improved market understanding or market mapping using one or all three of these particular techniques, we can talk about what it is you're able to achieve. Any questions just for now? All good? Cool. So what does good market mapping unlock, and is it worth it, right? Like if we do manage to map the market really effectively using some of the techniques that I've kind of described or discussed, we'll know the revenue opportunity and number of accounts that we have to play with. Importantly, I can prioritize the companies that look most likely to buy, and I can align my go-to-market around targeting those folks. As I said, I've done a separate session on prioritization, but I try not to predetermine qualitatively who you're going to prioritize within your kind of service addressable market that you've mapped in the sense that you see written about with SOM. Instead, I'd encourage you to quantitatively assess who you've had success with selling to in your market, look for positive and negative correlation in who you've won, who you've lost, who's responded, who hasn't responded, to determine attributes and to determine who you prioritize. Right? We did a whole webinar on this a month or so ago that you can have a look at. But for that exercise to be worthwhile at all, you need to have mapped the market effectively in the first place. Something else to call out at this stage before we get into some horror stories at Paddle and so on and so forth is to be really careful between the distinction between qualification and prioritization. And this is something else that I think people really get wrong. Probably the second most common pitfall after just trying to put the very biggest number they possibly can in the deck. It's actually a trap that I saw Paddle falling into quite recently. And I think a lot of it is due to the use of the word serviceable in the acronym serviceable addressable market. So as I said, Paddle can sell to any software company with a self-serve checkout over 20K MRR. This is our serviceable addressable market. But internally at Paddle, they've started to feel that they're a better fit for companies with less complex billing requirements. So not lots of plans, not doing usage-based pricing, etc. Now, the folks with complex billing requirements are still serviceable. They can use the Paddle product. They have a bunch of customers that are doing complex billing, right? They would just like to deprioritize them because they feel they're less likely to buy than someone who has less complex billing requirements, right? And watch out for this because serviceable can easily be confused with level of product fit. In that Paddle example, I'd want to include those with complex billing requirements in my market mapping. We qualify them in, they can use my product, they should be included in some of those stats, but I'd later like to deprioritize them and probably not put them in the hands of my sales reps because they have less likelihood to buy than some of the other folks that I've mapped, right? There is a real distinction between qualification and prioritization. And we cover that a little bit, again, in the prioritization webinar that we ran previously, but do think about that in the context of your market mapping too. In terms of some kind of horror stories or war stories about this, I'm really pleased to be able to get up here and share some of this stuff with you guys and share the importance of market mapping, particularly because we've definitely seen this go wrong at Paddle in my experience in the early days. So at Paddle, it was awesome. We were growing at like 300% year on year in the first 5 years of the business. Everything was great, triple, double, whatever it may be. And we were growing at such a rate, selling into independent Mac software companies. or developers to some degree. But around our Series A or Series B, we basically realized we couldn't keep scaling at the rate that we were with the same number of reps that we had. Like our sales team was less than 15 people, maybe less than 10 people throughout that entire 5-year period, but we just kept growing and growing and growing. What we realized was that we needed to actually hire a lot more people across the org, not just in sales, in order to keep up that rate of growth. We went from like 20 or 30 people to well over 100 in 8 months. Like it was absolute chaos. There was a lot more new people in the room than old, which was fun. And a lot of those folks that we were hiring were in go-to-market roles. But halfway through that kind of scaling process, having committed to a financial plan and a hiring plan, I basically just realized there weren't enough independent Mac software companies out there to meet my kind of growth demands or ambitions, right? I always knew I was operating in a small market. I just didn't actually have visibility into when I was going to exhaust it, since I hadn't effectively mapped it. So when we realized we started running out of accounts and we had to make this rapid shift towards B2B SaaS, which is Paddle's focus today, in order to do that, I had to evolve and accelerate like an entire product roadmap and build out product lines to cater for these folks. I even had to evolve our entire go-to-market because we were selling into a very different profile of buyer with different objections. We needed an entirely different call structure and sales process. Like we were literally almost rebuilding the business to sell into this adjacent market. And it resulted in our worst year of growth ever. But with absolute visibility into your service addressable market, you can make really strategic decisions as to how you need to grow this over time and when you need to pull the trigger on how you're going to expand your serviceable addressable market to avoid having to do this in real time and your growth really suffering. And I think Stephen was sharing a story very similar to me on the phone around a business that he launched. I don't know if he's still on the line. Are you there, Stephen, to share that?
Yeah. I mean, I was. This is a long time ago. At a software company selling into NHS trusts in the UK, and was spectacularly successful in the first 2 years and sold to about 100 of them. Only to then realise that actually I'd spoken to all 200 NHS trusts and there was nobody else to sell to. It led to quite a rude awakening and a kind of 6-month kind of re-evaluation of the problem I solved and the product and a complete rebuild of the tech platform. It's such a rookie mistake, right? But it is one that we make over and over.
And it's obvious, right? And I think as much as people know they need to solve it, I think people probably struggle to actually get to grips with just how many companies there are out there, given some of the limitations and difficulties we discussed today. But also it's definitely just better to know and invest a lot of time into this rather than burying your head in the sand. Like with the independent Mac software story here, like we always knew we were in a relatively small market, but just buried our head in the sand and didn't invest enough in determining when we were going to exhaust that. So this is definitely something that I'd focus on if I were you guys. Next, one other point that I just wanted to make before we do key takeaways is that I often hear questions around how mapping the market is different or how the requirements differ depending on like your go-to-market motion, the two most common being the product-led companies and the sales-led companies. That definitely influences things for me, as well as the stage you're at as a business. So very quickly on stage, like as mentioned, if you're at the stages of finding your first 3 customers and you've got like 0 revenue, just go out there and win some before worrying about how many there are probably, knowing that we can expand our serviceable addressable market over time. Don't get caught in the loop of just sitting in a room being very academic as opposed to actually going out there and winning some customers, which should be your focus. And that's no longer true as you start to grow your business, but do be mindful of that if you're in the early stages. When it comes to your go-to-market motion, on the sales-led side, at some level of team size and sophistication, you start to build books of business or assign accounts to specific reps, often based on region or like the size of that customer. And if this is the case, the more granular understanding you can get of what accounts are out there, how many there are available to distribute is critical, because it'll have a direct impact as to how many reps you can hire in certain regions or targeting certain sizes of businesses. You even want to gather a really deep understanding of each of those companies to distribute those that are most likely to buy to your reps as well. Like if you're spinning up a new territory, you want to know there's enough companies and revenue potential in the region for it to be worthwhile. Or if you're planning like headcount for FY23, you want to ensure there are enough accounts out there to actually feed the reps and meet those growth ambitions. Like this is why you want real granularity. On the product-led side, the benefits of mapping the market remain true, right? You want to know the size of your opportunity. You want to know the number of accounts out there. If you can align your team around a specific set of companies that are most likely to buy, awesome. You're going to get really good ROI on your ad spend or whatever it is that you're doing. However, again, I do feel in some cases less granular understanding is needed than the sales-led example that I discussed, right? And I'm going to give you two contradictory kind of options there because it's going to be really different for you and your business. So the first example is maybe like a to-do app for businesses, right? You could probably get away with running, say, your paid media if you're a to-do app for businesses at some quite generic audiences, right? Because the product is applicable to a really, really broad range of companies. And so you probably need a relatively high level understanding of the size of your market and who you need to target in order to go and win some customers. Now, don't get me wrong. I think you'd see better ROI on those ads if you're targeting them an incredibly narrow, high converting audience. But as I said right at the start, there is a cost to mapping the market and gathering a bunch of data on those companies rather than relying on some of the more default or easy to get to, say, industry filters. So as I said, ultimately mapping the market isn't a yes or no. It's what level of depth and sophistication do I want to get to? And you need to determine whether the ROI on getting that more specific granular understanding and thus targeting is worth it for you, i.e., does the cost to gather more intelligence on these companies improve performance such that it's worth the investment? And that's really going to depend on the business. For some it will, others it won't. The other example that I know that's product-led that are doing this is a company called Paragon. So they're an iPass solution, which basically is a tool that helps companies with their integrations, right? In theory, they could target any tech or software company, which is relatively high level via like paid media or whatever, because all of us are integrating with something these days, or normally a lot of things. But in mapping the market of tech companies and building an understanding of the company's existing integrations and understanding who owns the integrations in that business, they went really granular. I know that Paragon run all of their paid social, a very narrow set of accounts that line up directly with the integrations that that company has and the integrations that Paragon supports to a narrow set of decision makers, right? Because the most common objection Paragon got when they reached the demo phase was that your product looks great, I'd love to use it, but it doesn't support the integrations that I need, right? So in mapping the market and getting a really granular understanding of the companies they could sell to, they run product-led, but at a very specific set of accounts. And the ROI and the investment they put into mapping their market and getting that granular understanding was worth it because they're seeing a much better ROI on some of their paid efforts, for example. For the to-do app for businesses, I'm not sure that will be the case. It's going to differ depending on your business. Those two options making sense to folks? Or how it differs, I guess, on the go-to-market side? Awesome. Maybe just to wrap up then, because we don't have a lot of time, I'd encourage you to focus mainly on the accounts that you can sell to today, right? If these are the people we want to go out and win, and we should spend most of our time on. Do take comfort in knowing that those you can service can evolve over time. Don't fall into the trap of just trying to share the biggest number you can or convincing yourself that your market is absolutely huge. Have a deep understanding of who you can sell to and know that that can evolve over time. With visibility into the size of your market and even the size of future opportunities, if you're mapping the market of something that you could be doing in the future, you can confidently articulate how you're going to grow that addressable market over time, right? When you're doing the actual mapping, industry filters, among other sources, sometimes struggle to give you accurate kind of market estimations or accounts that are truly qualified for you. You're going to see a lot of false positives and a lot of false negatives. The way you can overcome those at a basic level is through humans, albeit you're going to struggle a little bit with scalability at some stage. Perhaps you're one of the lucky few where aggregators actually provide a high enough level of qualification that they're actually just a really good way to map your market, like KissenHub or Muse, who are looking for hotels. Or you can actually build a custom model for you and your business based on the labeled data maybe that you've got from some humans to actually programmatically predict whether someone should be included in your market mapping or not. And last but not least, the level of depth you actually need in terms of market mapping and your understanding of these businesses should really differ based on the stage you're at and your kind of go-to-market motion.